The actual test works by measuring the expression of about 21 different genes and then calculating a recurrence score, which tells you how likely the cancer is to come back and also tells you how much benefit there is likely to be for using chemotherapy in addition to hormone treatment. And usually the test is done on a piece of the tissue which is sent to a central reference lab. So many institutions put algorithms in place for which patients they're going to test automatically and which they're not, and that sometimes helps speed up the process a little bit. In terms of how it affects practice, it's actually been very powerful for allowing patients to both understand the pros and cons of treatment and to make them feel better about the decisions that you reach jointly. We've had a lot of the same information that the genomic tests provide for a long time. For a long time we've had grade and estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, HER2, and we can also use another test called Ki67, which many centers use to understand grade and proliferation. And when you integrate all those pieces of information, you can come up with a good decision for the patient. But what's interesting is that until we had the Oncotype DX test, we were never able to get to the point where you could sit down with a patient and say with confidence, and this is really the key point, you got to stand up straight and you got to look them in the eye and you got to say, you don't need chemo. I mean, that's a very important thing to be able to say, because patients will accept chemotherapy even if there's a small whiff of benefit. So the impressive thing about the test is that it allows us to really say with tremendous confidence that this patient does not need chemotherapy, that patient clearly does need chemotherapy, and being able to sit with a patient and say there truly is essentially zero benefit for you is critical. If you don't get to that 0 point, it's hard to convince people not to get chemotherapy. So that's why it's been so revolutionary. It's allowed people to really get to the point where the doctor and the medical team can look at the patient, look at the clinical situation, and really say, I do not think there's any benefit for chemotherapy. We use the test, as I said, in women where there's controversy as to whether or not they should get chemotherapy. So for patients who have little tiny, less than 1 centimeter cancers, it's usually hard to imagine that chemotherapy is going to make a huge impact if it's estrogen receptor positive. And by contrast, multiple positive nodes, again, usually you give chemotherapy to those patients. There are some instances which are a little unusual where the test is helpful. So one is the larger tumor, but it still has favorable biological features. So this is a 3 centimeter cancer, but it's low grade. You want to avoid chemotherapy if you can. Test is very helpful. Similarly, for people who have 1 or 2 positive lymph nodes, I also use the test. The data for node-positive breast cancer are very similar to the data for node-negative in the sense that the test still tells you who's likely to benefit for chemotherapy or not. So a 62-year-old who had 1 positive lymph node, a low-grade tumor, intermediate grade, low Oncotype score, again, hard to think there's going to be a major benefit for chemotherapy. That's another sweet spot for using the test. The place I think people get into trouble is when they know what they should do already, but then they order the test to confirm it. That comes back to the original point we made. It's not a substitute for integrating the rest of what you already know about the patient and about the tumor.